If you own a classic car built before the mid-90s, there's a decent chance somebody has told you, just find some R-12 and recharge the AC. It's the good stuff. It's stronger. It's better than the new refrigerants. And on paper, that advice isn't even wrong. R-12 really was an incredible refrigerant. It was cheap, it was stable, it wasn't toxic, it cooled beautifully, and for about 60 years it was the single most trusted substance in automotive air conditioning anywhere on the planet. So here's the real question nobody actually answers clearly. If R-12 worked so well, why did the entire world agree to ban it? Why did governments who usually can't agree on anything sit down together and outlaw a substance that was sitting quietly inside hundreds of millions of car air conditioners, causing no visible harm to anyone standing next to the car? The answer has almost nothing to do with your engine, your comfort, or your wallet. It has to do with something happening 12 miles above your head. And once you understand what that something is, you'll never look at an old can of Freon the same way again. Stick around because by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly what R-12 does once it leaves your car, why a molecule can survive in the atmosphere for a full century, why one single pound of the stuff can do the same climate damage as over 11,000 pounds of carbon dioxide, and why even today using it is not just outdated, it's illegal. And I'll also walk you through exactly what replaced it, why that replacement is now also on its way out, and what's actually sitting under the hood of the car in your driveway right now. Let's rewind to before any of this was a problem, because understanding why R-12 got banned starts with understanding why it existed in the first place, and honestly, why it was considered a miracle when it showed up. Before the 1930s, keeping things cold was genuinely dangerous business. Refrigeration and early air conditioning relied on a rotating cast of chemicals: ammonia, sulfur dioxide, methyl chloride, and a few others, and every single one of them came with a serious downside. Ammonia was effective but highly toxic if it leaked, and leaks happened. Sulfur dioxide was corrosive and unpleasant. Propane and other hydrocarbons worked fine thermodynamically, but were dangerously flammable in an enclosed system near an engine. Carbon dioxide was safe to breathe and non-flammable, but it needed enormous pressure to function properly, which made the equipment bulky, expensive, and prone to catastrophic failure if something went wrong. There simply wasn't a refrigerant that checked every box: safe, stable, affordable, and effective, all at once. Then, in the early 1930s, General Motors and DuPont formed a partnership specifically to solve this problem. A chemist named Thomas Midgley Jr., working with a small team, developed a new class of chemical compounds called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. R-12, chemically known as dichlorodifluoromethane, was one of the first and most successful of these compounds, and it was, by nearly every practical measure available at the time, a genuine breakthrough. It cooled efficiently. It moved through mechanical systems smoothly, mixing well with lubricating oil so it didn't damage internal components. It didn't corrode metal. And critically, unlike ammonia or propane, it was neither toxic to breathe in normal exposure nor dangerously flammable. For the first time, refrigeration and air conditioning had a chemical that was actually safe for regular people to be around. It's honestly hard to overstate how big of a deal that was. Within a few decades, R-12, sold under the brand name Freon, had become the global standard. It was in home refrigerators. It was in commercial cooling systems. And by the time car air conditioning became a mainstream feature, R-12 was in nearly every single vehicle equipped with AC across the entire world. For about 50 years, nobody thought twice about it. It worked. It was cheap. It didn't seem to be hurting anyone. And that's exactly what made what happened next so unsettling. Because the danger wasn't happening down here where anyone could see it. It was happening in a part of the atmosphere almost nobody thinks about. So here's where the story turns. And this is the part most people genuinely don't understand. Even people who vaguely know R-12 was bad for the ozone. Let's actually walk through the mechanism, because once you see how it works, the reasoning behind the ban becomes completely obvious. High above the Earth's surface, in a layer of the atmosphere called the stratosphere, there's a thin band of ozone molecules that acts like a planetary sunscreen. This ozone layer absorbs the majority of the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation before it ever reaches the ground. Without it, that radiation would hit the Earth's surface at a much higher intensity dramatically increasing rates of skin cancer, cataracts, and damage to plant and marine life that forms the base of entire ecosystems. This layer isn't optional. It's one of the quiet reasons complex life on land is even possible. Now here's what R-12 does. When it leaks from a car's air conditioning system, or gets vented during service, or escapes when an old vehicle or appliance is scrapped and not properly disposed of, that gas doesn't just disappear. Because R-12 is remarkably chemically stable, the exact property that made it such a great refrigerant, it doesn't break down in the lower atmosphere the way most substances do. Instead, it slowly drifts upward over months and years, until it eventually reaches the stratosphere. And that's where the stability that made it so useful becomes catastrophic. Because up there, ultraviolet radiation from the sun is finally intense enough to break the molecule apart. When that happens, it releases chlorine atoms. And chlorine is the villain of this entire story. Here's the part that should genuinely alarm you. A single chlorine atom released from a broken down R-12 molecule doesn't just destroy one ozone molecule and then stop. It acts as a catalyst, meaning it destroys an ozone molecule, gets released unchanged afterward, and then goes on to destroy another one, and another, and another. A single chlorine atom from R-12 can remain active in the stratosphere and continue destroying ozone molecules for up to 100 years before it finally gets neutralized. One atom, 100 years. Thousands of ozone molecules destroyed along the way. That's not a typo, and that's not an exaggeration, that's the actual documented chemistry. This is why scientists use something called ozone depletion potential, or ODP, to measure how damaging a substance is to the ozone layer, and R-12 sits at the absolute top of that scale, with an ODP of 1.0. That number isn't just high, it's literally the benchmark. Every other ozone-depleting substance is measured relative to R-12 because it represents the maximum possible impact. And there's a second layer to this story that often gets left out entirely. Because ozone depletion wasn't the only problem. R-12 also has an almost unbelievable global warming potential. Depending on the specific time frame measured, its warming impact sits somewhere around 11,200 times that of carbon dioxide. Read that again. 1 pound of R-12 released into the atmosphere traps roughly the same amount of heat as over 11,000 pounds of carbon dioxide. So this wasn't a substance with one environmental flaw. It was a substance with two enormous ones, quietly stacked on top of each other, hiding behind decades of being marketed as perfectly safe. So how did anyone even figure this out? This wasn't obvious. Nobody could see chlorine atoms floating 12 miles above their head. The discovery actually traces back to research in the 1970s, when scientists first began theorizing that CFCs could be reaching the stratosphere and reacting with ozone. But the moment that turned theory into undeniable, headline-making proof came in the 1980s, when a team of researchers monitoring the atmosphere over Antarctica discovered something that shouldn't have been possible: a massive, rapidly growing hole in the ozone layer, concentrated right over the South Pole. This wasn't a gradual, subtle thinning that only specialists could detect with sensitive equipment. It was a dramatic, measurable, expanding gap in the planet's protective shield, and it was directly correlated with the rise of CFC usage worldwide, R-12 included. That discovery changed everything. Governments that rarely agreed on environmental policy suddenly found themselves facing a problem with an unusually clean, unambiguous cause and effect relationship. This wasn't a slow-moving, debatable issue like broader climate change, where the mechanisms are complex and the effects unfold over generations. This was a chemical, going up, breaking down, releasing chlorine, destroying ozone, with a visible hole growing over Antarctica as the receipts. The science was frankly hard to argue with. In 1987, representatives from countries around the world gathered in Montreal, Canada, and signed what became known as the Montreal Protocol, a treaty specifically designed to phase out and eventually eliminate the production and use of ozone-depleting substances, starting with CFCs like R-12. This treaty is still, to this day, considered one of the most successful international environmental agreements ever created, precisely because nearly every country in the world actually followed through on it. In the United States, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 formally aligned domestic law with the goals of the Montreal Protocol. The automotive industry specifically began transitioning away from R-12, starting around 1992 and 1993, with most new vehicles switching over to a replacement refrigerant by the mid-90s. By 1995 and 96, the production and importation of R-12 for most uses was formally banned in the United States, and R-12 was officially classified as a controlled substance under federal law. It didn't happen instantly. Older systems already in use were allowed continued servicing using reclaimed and recycled supplies rather than newly manufactured product. But the tap for new R-12 was, for all practical purposes, shut off for good. Now here's a question worth pausing on, because it's one that engineers and regulators had to solve almost immediately. If you suddenly ban the refrigerant sitting inside tens of millions of existing vehicles, what happens to all of those cars? The answer was R-134A, a refrigerant belonging to a different chemical family called hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. R-134A was specifically engineered to solve the ozone problem, and it succeeded completely on that front. It contains no chlorine whatsoever, which means it has essentially zero ozone depletion potential. Automakers began phasing it in starting around 1992 and 93, and by the mid to late 90s, it had become the new global standard for automotive air conditioning, remaining dominant for roughly the next 2.5 decades. But here's the twist that a lot of people don't realize, and it's honestly one of the more frustrating chapters in this entire story. R-134A solved the ozone problem beautifully. It did not solve the climate problem. In fact, its global warming potential still sits at around 1,430 times that of carbon dioxide. That's dramatically lower than R-12's 11,200. Don't get me wrong, but it's still an enormous number in absolute terms. Regulators essentially traded one major environmental problem for a smaller, but still very real one. Which brings us to right now, to the car you're probably sitting in or standing next to while you're listening to this. Starting in the 2010s, driven largely by tightening regulations in the European Union, and eventually the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the automotive industry began transitioning again, this time to a refrigerant called R-1234YF. This one belongs to yet another chemical family, hydrofluorolefins, or HFOs, and its global warming potential is almost absurdly low, sitting at around just 4, compared to R-134A's 1430. It also breaks down in the atmosphere in roughly 11 days, compared to R-134A's 13-year atmospheric lifespan. As of the early 2020s, R-1234YF became effectively mandatory for new light-duty vehicles sold in the United States, and if your car was built in 2021 or later, it is almost certainly running this refrigerant right now. Meanwhile, R-134A production itself is now being phased down under federal regulation, meaning that even the refrigerant that replaced the refrigerant is now on a countdown clock of its own. So let's connect all 3 chapters of this story together, because there's a thread running through every single one of these transitions that tells you something important about how environmental regulation actually tends to work. R-12 got banned because of an immediate, visible, catastrophic problem, a literal hole in the ozone layer that scientists could point to and measure. R-134A is being phased down because of a slower, less visible, but still serious problem, its outsized contribution to global warming. And R-1234YF was specifically engineered from the ground up to avoid repeating either mistake, extremely low ozone impact, extremely low warming impact, and a molecule that simply doesn't stick around long enough in the atmosphere to cause the kind of century-long damage that R-12 was capable of. If you're driving a genuinely old vehicle, something from the late 80s or early 90s that still has its original air conditioning system, there's a real chance it was built for R-12. And I want to be straight with you here, if that's your situation. Using R-12 today isn't just outdated advice. It's illegal for anyone other than a certified technician to purchase or handle in most circumstances. And any remaining legitimate supply comes exclusively from reclaimed and recycled stock, not new production, because manufacturing new R-12 has been prohibited for decades. The overwhelmingly recommended path today, if you own one of these classic systems, is a professional retrofit to R-134A, which typically involves flushing the system, replacing the receiver dryer or accumulator, and swapping in seals and hoses that are chemically compatible with the new refrigerant. It's not free, and it's not always simple, but it's the legal, responsible, and honestly more practical path forward, especially given how difficult and expensive tracking down legitimate R-12 has become. Here's the takeaway I want you to walk away with. R-12 wasn't banned because it was a bad refrigerant. In almost every practical sense, it was a great one. That's exactly why it dominated the market for 60 straight years. It was banned because being a great refrigerant and being a safe atmospheric chemical turned out to be two completely different things. And by the time the world figured out the difference, there was a measurable hole opening up in the sky above Antarctica to prove it. The story of R-12, R-134A, and now R-1234YF isn't really a story about air conditioning at all. It's a story about how one industry, over the span of about 90 years, was forced to keep relearning the same lesson, that what happens inside your car's AC system doesn't stay inside your car's AC system. It eventually finds its way, up and up and up, until it's 12 miles above your head, quietly rewriting the chemistry of the atmosphere that keeps all of us alive down here. If this changed the way you think about that old can of Freon sitting in your garage, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this kind of story to tell, and I'll see you in the next one.